He thought breaking her would take less than 5 minutes. Just another witness. Just another voice to corner and control. But the truth has a way of waiting for the perfect moment. And that morning, inside a quiet courtroom in downtown Chicago, it was already unfolding beneath polished wood and cold marble floors, unnoticed by the man who believed he owned the room. Jonathan Pierce adjusted his cufflinks as he stood, his navy suit sharp, his reputation sharper, a trial attorney known across the state for dismantling testimonies with surgical precision. Juries trusted him, judges respected him, and opponents feared him, because when Jonathan spoke, cases shifted and outcomes followed. Across from him sat Evelyn Carter, hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, dressed in a simple beige cardigan and dark skirt, the kind of presence people overlooked without thinking twice. And that was exactly what everyone in that room did, including Jonathan, who barely spared her a second glance before beginning. The courtroom carried that low, electric tension, the kind that hums beneath silence, sunlight filtering through tall windows casting long shadows across the gallery where spectators leaned forward, sensing something important but not yet knowing why. "Miss Carter," Jonathan began, his voice smooth, controlled, almost polite, but edged with something colder beneath. "Let's keep this efficient." A few jurors nodded subtly, already aligning themselves with his authority, already trusting the confidence in his tone. Evelyn lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze without challenge, without fear, just steady. And for a fraction of a second, something about that stillness lingered, something Jonathan dismissed as hesitation. He stepped closer, measured, deliberate. "You testified that you were present the night of the incident," he said, pacing lightly, each step echoing against the marble. "But your view was partially obstructed, correct?" His words were precise, guiding, narrowing the path she could take until only one answer seemed possible. Evelyn paused, not long, just enough for the room to notice, just enough for the silence to stretch. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice even. Jonathan gave a faint smile, the kind that never reached his eyes, the kind that signaled control. "So you would agree that your identification of the individual is uncertain?" A soft murmur rippled through the gallery, subtle but present, the beginning of doubt taking root. He continued without waiting, layering question upon question, tightening the frame, each statement shaping perception before she could fully respond, and with every passing second, it appeared exactly as he intended, a simple witness unraveling under pressure. But what no one realized, not the jury, not the spectators, and certainly not Jonathan Pierce, was that Evelyn Carter wasn't losing control of the moment. She was measuring it, letting it build, allowing every assumption in that room to settle into place before she decided to speak again. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't to interrupt, it's to wait until everyone is certain they already understand the story, just before you prove them wrong. Jonathan Pierce did not slow down, not even for a second, because momentum was his greatest weapon, and he could feel it building now, settling over the courtroom like a quiet tide pulling everyone in his direction, his voice steady, controlled, never raised yet impossible to ignore. "Let us clarify this for the jury," he continued, turning just enough to include them in his orbit. "You were positioned approximately 20 feet away, correct?" Evelyn nodded once, calm, measured, and again there was that slight pause before she spoke. Not hesitation, but timing. Something subtle that slipped past most in the room, but lingered just long enough to create a faint ripple beneath the surface. "Approximately, yes," she replied, her tone unchanged, neither defensive nor uncertain, just precise. Jonathan gave a small, knowing smile as he stepped closer to the jury box, using space as a tool, guiding their attention away from her and toward him. And at that distance, with limited visibility, it would be fair to say that details could be misinterpreted. The word hung in the air, carefully chosen, not an accusation, but a suggestion planted. Where doubt could grow, a juror shifted in his seat, another leaned back slightly, their expressions tightening as they processed the implication, and Jonathan saw it, recognized it. The moment when perception began to tilt, when confidence started to erode, and he pressed forward without hesitation, layering his questions with increasing precision, each one narrowing the frame, each one designed to leave her with fewer options. Fewer words, fewer paths to clarity. You did not speak to law enforcement immediately, did you? He asked, his tone almost casual, as if the answer was already known, already decided. No, Evelyn answered, and for the first time, a faint murmur spread through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable, the sound of assumptions beginning to form. Jonathan nodded slowly, as though confirming what he had expected all along. So your recollection is not only distant, but delayed, he said, turning fully now to face the jury, allowing the statement to settle as fact rather than question, a technique he had perfected over years, shaping narratives without ever appearing to force them. The judge watched quietly, hands folded, allowing the exchange to continue, and the air in the room grew heavier, thicker, as if every word added weight to an outcome that seemed increasingly inevitable. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly together, her breathing steady, her eyes following Jonathan not with fear, but with something far more difficult to read, something that did not align with the role he had assigned her, and yet he ignored it, dismissing it as composure under pressure, nothing more. He moved again, slow and deliberate, closing the distance just enough to reinforce control. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice softening slightly, almost sympathetic now, a shift designed to appear reasonable. Would you agree that in a situation like that, under stress, from that distance, with your view partially obstructed, it is entirely possible that what you believe you saw is not entirely accurate? The question lingered, heavy, final, the kind that often ended testimony, the kind that sealed doubt in the minds of those listening. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that pressed against the walls and settled into every corner, and for a brief moment, it appeared as though everything Jonathan had constructed was about to hold, about to solidify into the conclusion he wanted. Because Evelyn Carter did not answer immediately, she did not rush to defend herself, she did not challenge the framing. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, longer this time, long enough for the jury to lean in, for the judge to glance up, for Jonathan to believe that the hesitation meant uncertainty, meant weakness, meant that he had succeeded, when in reality, she was simply waiting for the exact moment when every assumption in that room had fully taken root, because only then would the truth have the power to break them all at once. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not empty, but deliberate, as if Evelyn Carter was allowing every word Jonathan Pierce had spoken to settle into the minds of the jury, into the assumptions forming behind their eyes, and Jonathan mistook it for hesitation, for uncertainty, for the final crack in a testimony he had been carefully dismantling piece by piece. And he took a slow breath, already preparing to close the loop, already confident that the narrative was his. It is a simple question, Ms. Carter, he said, his tone calm, but edged with quiet insistence. Is it possible that you are mistaken? The courtroom seemed to lean forward, the weight of the moment pressing against the walls, and for a second, it looked as though Evelyn might simply agree, might let the doubt stand, might allow his version of events to become the only version that mattered. But instead, she lifted her gaze, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his eyes with a steadiness that did not belong to someone cornered. And when she spoke, her voice was clear, measured, and impossible to ignore. No, she said, a single word that did not rise in volume, but carried across the room with precision. And it was not the answer Jonathan expected, not the one he had prepared for. And for the first time, a faint flicker of something crossed his expression, subtle but real, because certainty had not been part of the script he wrote for her. He recovered quickly, adjusting his stance, tightening his focus. You are saying, under oath, that despite the distance, despite the obstruction, despite the delay, your identification is accurate. He pressed, his voice now carrying a sharper edge, less patient, more forceful, and Evelyn did not look away, did not shift, did not soften. I am saying, she replied. And again she paused, not out of doubt, but out of control, choosing her words with a precision that mirrored his own, that what I saw was clear. A murmur rippled through the gallery, small but growing, the kind of sound that signals a shift too subtle to name but too present to ignore, and Jonathan felt it. recognized it as a disruption to the rhythm he had built, and he moved quickly to regain control, stepping closer, closing the distance. Clear, he repeated, almost incredulous, from 20 feet away. With your view partially blocked, you are telling this court that you had a clear line of sight. His words sharpened, pushing harder now, pressing for contradiction, for weakness, for anything that would fracture her statement. And the judge watched more closely now, pen stilled, attention narrowing, sensing that something in the exchange had changed. Evelyn's hands remained still, her posture unchanged, but her presence in the room shifted in a way that could not be explained by words alone. It was no longer passive, no longer overlooked. It was grounded, deliberate, and when she answered, she did not rush. She did not defend. She simply placed the truth where it could not be ignored. My line of sight was not obstructed in the way you are suggesting, she said, and the phrasing itself caused a subtle reaction. A few jurors straightened, the precision of her words cutting through the assumptions that had been carefully planted, and Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because this was not how witnesses usually responded. This was not confusion or fear. This was control, and for the first time, the path he had laid out began to feel less certain beneath his feet. But he pushed forward anyway, because stepping back was not something he knew how to do. Then explain, he said, his voice firmer now, less composed than before, how you could possibly be so certain. And again, the room fell into that heavy, waiting silence. But this time it felt different, not like the quiet before collapse, but like the moment just before something irreversible is revealed. And Evelyn Carter, still calm, still steady, drew a breath as if she had been waiting for that exact question all along. The room held its breath as Evelyn Carter finally moved, not dramatically, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that shifted the balance of attention without a single raised voice. Her eyes steady on Jonathan Pierce as though she had already stepped beyond the pressure he was trying to build around her. And when she spoke, it was not to defend herself, not to argue, but to clarify something far deeper than the question itself. Because the obstruction you keep referring to, she said, calmly, each word placed with deliberate care, was not where you are suggesting it was. And that subtle correction landed heavier than any objection, because it did not challenge his authority directly. It simply exposed a flaw in the foundation he had been constructing from the beginning. Jonathan blinked once, just once, the kind of reaction so small most would miss it. But in a courtroom where every gesture mattered, it echoed louder than words, and he adjusted his stance, straightening slightly as if regaining control of the narrative required nothing more than posture and tone. Then please, he said, the edge in his voice now unmistakable, enlighten the court. But there was a shift now, faint but undeniable. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier no longer felt absolute, and even the jury seemed to sense it, their attention no longer anchored solely to him. Evelyn did not rush. She did not take advantage of the moment with volume or emotion. Instead, she let the silence return, not as hesitation, but as emphasis, allowing every person in that room to lean forward, to listen more carefully than before. And when she continued, her voice remained level, almost gentle. You have described the scene as though my view was blocked by distance and position, she said, her gaze unwavering. But that is not accurate. Another ripple moved through the gallery, quieter this time but deeper, the kind that signals understanding beginning to shift direction, and Jonathan's jaw tightened again, the first real sign that control was slipping from his grasp, not through confrontation, but through precision. He stepped closer, perhaps unconsciously, closing the space between them as if proximity could restore authority. You testified earlier that there were people between you and the individual. He pressed, his tone sharper now, faster, less measured. And that change did not go unnoticed, the judge's eyes narrowing slightly as the rhythm of the questioning began to fracture. But Evelyn remained exactly as she had been, still, composed, unshaken. Yes, she said, acknowledging the point without resistance. There were. And for a brief second, it seemed as though she had reinforced his argument, as though she had stepped back into the narrative he was trying to impose, and Jonathan seized on it immediately. Then your line of sight was obstructed, he concluded, his voice firm, almost triumphant, the statement delivered as though it settled everything once and for all, and a few heads in the jury box nodded instinctively, drawn back toward the structure he had been building from the start. But Evelyn did not respond immediately. And this time the silence felt different again, not heavy with pressure, not stretched by uncertainty, but sharpened, focused, as if something precise was about to land, something that would not be undone once spoken. And when she finally spoke, her tone did not rise, it did not shift, but it carried a clarity that cut through the room with quiet force. "My line of sight was only obstructed," she said slowly, "until you stepped into it." And the words settled into the space between them with a weight that no one could ignore, because in that single clarification, the narrative Jonathan Pierce had constructed did not just weaken, it began to turn inward on itself. And for the first time since the questioning began, the courtroom was no longer following him, it was watching her. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the meaning of her words did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a realization that refuses to be ignored, and Jonathan Pierce felt it before he fully understood it. The shift, the subtle but undeniable turning of attention away from him and toward her, and that alone was something he had not anticipated, because control, once established, was not supposed to slip, not like this, not in front of a jury, not in front of a judge who was now leaning forward with a sharper gaze than before. Jonathan straightened, his expression tightening just enough to betray the first crack beneath his composure. "That is not what you testified earlier," he said quickly, his voice firmer now, pushing back, attempting to reframe, to regain ground that had already begun to erode. But Evelyn did not react to the urgency in his tone. She did not match it. She did not challenge it. She simply held her position, steady and unshaken. "It is exactly what I testified," she replied, her voice calm, each word measured. But it was not presented that way. And that distinction, subtle yet precise, landed with a weight that carried beyond the words themselves, because it did not accuse, it revealed. A faint murmur moved through the gallery, quieter than before, but more focused, as if the room itself was beginning to understand that something fundamental had been misrepresented, and Jonathan felt the pressure of that awareness building, pressing against the narrative he had constructed so carefully. He took a step back this time, not forward, a movement small but telling, and for the first time, the space between them no longer belonged entirely to him. "You are suggesting," he said, choosing his words more carefully now, "that my position in the courtroom is relevant to your testimony." But the question no longer carried the same confidence, the same controlled precision. It felt narrower, reactive, and the judge's pen, which had been still, now moved slowly across the page as if marking a moment worth noting. Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "I am stating," she said, her tone unchanged, "that on the night in question, someone stood between me and the individual." She paused just long enough for the room to follow her thought, for the connection to begin forming. "And that person's presence is the reason my view was partially blocked." The jury shifted again, this time not in doubt, but in reconsideration, because the narrative was no longer simple, no longer contained within the boundaries Jonathan had drawn. It was expanding, revealing a perspective that had not been accounted for. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his mind moving quickly now, recalculating, searching for a way to contain what was slipping beyond his control. "And you are certain of that?" he pressed, but the question no longer sounded like a trap. It sounded like a necessity, like an attempt to anchor something that was already drifting, and Evelyn answered without hesitation, "Yes." And that single word carried more weight now than any statement she had made before, because it was no longer standing alone. It was supported by clarity, by consistency, by a quiet confidence that did not need to be proven, only recognized. The room grew still again, but not with the same tension as before. This silence was different. It was filled with awareness, with the sense that something had shifted irreversibly, and Jonathan Pierce, a man who had built his career on controlling outcomes, found himself standing in a moment he could no longer fully direct, because the truth, once it begins to surface, does not ask for permission to be heard. It simply waits for the right question to expose it, and in that courtroom, that moment had already begun. Jonathan Pierce felt the shift before he could fully control it. The kind of shift that does not announce itself loudly but settles into the room like a quiet certainty. And for the first time since he had risen to question Evelyn Carter, the rhythm that had always guided him began to falter, not dramatically, not enough for most to name it, but enough for the judge to lean in slightly and for the jury to stop following his words automatically. And that alone was dangerous, because in a courtroom, control is not lost all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, in moments exactly like this. Jonathan inhaled slowly, steadying himself, recalibrating the strategy that had never failed him before. "Let us be very clear," he said, his tone tightening just enough to signal a shift from confidence to precision. "You are now identifying an additional individual who has not been previously established in your testimony." The statement was careful, structured to reframe her clarification as inconsistency, to suggest that what she was saying now did not align with what had been said before. And for a brief second, it almost worked. A few jurors exchanged glances, the old doubt flickering again, searching for something solid to hold on to. But Evelyn did not rush to defend. She did not interrupt. She simply listened, allowing him to finish, allowing the framing to settle fully into the room before she answered. Because correction without timing has no power. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, unwavering. "No," she said, and the simplicity of that single word cut through the complexity he had just introduced. "I am identifying the same individual who has always been there." The phrasing was deliberate, not adding, not changing, but revealing, and it forced the room to reconsider not what she was saying, but how it had been understood. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind moving faster now, searching for ground that no longer felt stable beneath him. "Then why?" he pressed, his voice sharper now, less controlled. "Was this not made explicit in your earlier statements?" And the question carried weight, because it implied omission. It implied that something important had been left unsaid, something that could weaken credibility if left unresolved. Evelyn held his gaze, her posture unchanged, her presence now impossible to overlook. "Because," she replied, and this time the pause was intentional, measured, drawing every eye in the room toward her. No one asked the right question, and the impact of those words moved through the courtroom, like a quiet wave, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, because it did not accuse, it did not defend, it exposed a gap, a space where assumption had replaced clarity. The judge's pen stopped again, his attention fixed fully now, and the jury shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, because the structure they had been given was no longer complete, no longer sufficient. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, to redirect, to regain the narrative that had begun to slip beyond his reach. But the certainty that had always fueled his voice was no longer there in the same way, and for the first time, the words did not come as easily, because the truth, once it begins to reorganize the room, does not need force to move forward, it only needs space, and Evelyn Carter, with nothing more than patience and precision, had already created it. Jonathan Pierce had built his entire career on one principle, that control of the narrative meant control of the outcome, and for years that belief had never failed him. But now, standing in a courtroom that no longer moved in rhythm with his voice, he felt something unfamiliar pressing at the edges of his certainty, not fear, not yet, but resistance, the kind that does not confront directly, the kind that simply refuses to be shaped. He straightened his shoulders, drawing in a slow breath as if composure alone could restore order. "Questions are not the responsibility of the witness," he said, his tone firm again, reclaiming structure. "They are the responsibility of counsel." And the statement carried weight, a reminder of authority, of process, of roles that were not meant to be blurred. And for a moment, the room responded to it, the old framework settling back into place just enough to steady the air. But Evelyn Carter did not retreat into that structure. She did not accept the boundaries he was attempting to reestablish. She simply acknowledged them without surrendering to them. "That is correct," she said calmly, her voice even. "But answers are still the responsibility of truth." And the distinction landed with quiet force, not as opposition, but as something deeper, something that could not be dismissed without consequence. A juror leaned forward slightly, another shifted in their seat, and the subtle movement of attention continued, not dramatically, but steadily, like a current that had already changed direction. Jonathan's gaze sharpened, his mind working faster now, searching for a way to redirect, to regain the clarity that had once been effortless. "Let us return to the facts," he said, his words more deliberate now, each one placed with care. "You claim that someone stood between you and the individual." He paused, allowing the statement to settle. "Can you identify that person?" The question was direct, precise, a calculated attempt to force specificity, because specificity could be challenged, could be tested, could be broken. Evelyn did not hesitate this time, not even for a fraction of a second. "Yes," she said, and the certainty in her voice carried further now, reaching beyond the stand, beyond the courtroom, into the very structure of the case itself. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he continued, "Then please identify that individual for the court." And the room grew still again. But this silence was no longer filled with expectation of failure. It was filled with something else, something sharper, something that felt closer to revelation. Evelyn shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but with purpose, her eyes steady as they remained fixed on Jonathan Pierce. And for the first time, there was something unmistakable in that gaze, not challenge, not defiance, but recognition, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact question, from the very beginning. The judge leaned forward, the pen in his hand stilled once more, and the jury's attention locked fully onto the witness stand, no longer divided, no longer uncertain, because whatever came next would not be easily undone. Jonathan felt it too, the weight of the moment, the narrowing of possibilities, and yet he did not step back, because stepping back was not something he had ever learned to do. "Go ahead," he said, his voice controlled, but thinner now, stretched by something he could not fully contain. Evelyn Carter drew a quiet breath, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, and when she spoke, she did not raise her voice, she did not rush. She simply allowed the truth to arrive exactly where it needed to be. "The person who stood between me and the individual," she said. Slowly, each word clear, deliberate, irreversible, "was you." And in that instant, the courtroom did not erupt. It did not react loudly. It simply stopped, completely, because the weight of what had just been said did not need volume to be understood. It needed only a moment, and that moment had already begun to change everything. For a fraction of a second, time did not move. It did not rush forward or collapse into chaos. It simply stopped, suspended in the space between what had been assumed and what had just been revealed. And Jonathan Pierce stood there, the words echoing in a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, because in all his years, in all the cases he had dominated, no one had ever turned the structure against him so precisely, so quietly, and yet so completely. His expression did not shatter, not visibly, he was too practiced for that, but something behind it shifted, something that could not be masked by posture or tone, and the jury saw it, not as a dramatic reaction, but as a subtle fracture in the certainty they had been following. The judge leaned forward now, no longer passive, his gaze fixed sharply on Jonathan. "Counsel," he said, his voice measured but carrying authority that filled the room. "Do you wish to respond to that statement?" And for the first time, the question was not directed at the witness, not framed by the attorney, but aimed squarely at the man who had been controlling the narrative from the beginning. Jonathan inhaled, a controlled breath, but it came slower than before, as if his mind was recalibrating faster than his voice could keep up. "Your Honor," he began, his tone still formal, still composed, but thinner now, less anchored. "The witness is making an inference that is not supported by—" He paused, just briefly, and that pause, small as it was, carried weight, because it was not strategic, it was necessary. Evelyn did not interrupt. She did not add to the moment. She simply remained still, allowing the silence to do what it was already doing, letting the truth stand without reinforcement, and that restraint made it stronger, not weaker. One of the jurors shifted forward, elbows resting lightly on the rail, eyes narrowing as if replaying the earlier testimony, as if reconstructing the scene not through Jonathan's framing, but through Evelyn's clarity, and the more they considered it, the less stable the original narrative became. Jonathan straightened slightly, forcing his voice back into form. "The positioning in this courtroom is not reflective of the events in question. he said, his words carefully chosen, attempting to separate the present from the past, to create distance where none had existed moments ago, but the argument lacked the sharpness it once carried, because it was no longer building, it was defending. The judge's expression did not change, but his silence spoke more than interruption would have, and the absence of immediate support allowed Evelyn's statement to settle deeper into the room, to take hold in a way that could not be undone by explanation alone. The gallery remained quiet, but it was no longer passive, it was attentive, fully engaged, watching not for spectacle, but for truth, and that shift changed everything. Evelyn finally spoke again, not to challenge, not to escalate, but to complete what had already begun. My testimony has not changed, she said calmly, her voice steady. Only the perspective from which it is being understood, and that distinction, simple yet profound, reframed the entire exchange, because it did not introduce new information. It revealed what had always been there. Jonathan felt it, the ground beneath his argument. No longer solid, no longer predictable, and for the first time, the case he believed he controlled was no longer moving in a direction he could define. Because when truth is not louder, but clearer, it does not overpower, it outlasts. And in that courtroom, clarity had just taken the lead. The courtroom did not return to its previous rhythm, not after that moment. Not after the quiet precision with which Evelyn Carter had redirected the entire frame of the case. Because once attention shifts from performance to truth, it does not easily move back, and Jonathan Pierce could feel that shift settling deeper with every passing second, not in noise, not in visible disruption, but in the way the jury no longer followed his pacing, in the way the judge's gaze remained fixed, waiting rather than allowing. And that waiting was something Jonathan had rarely experienced. He adjusted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if recalibration required more than confidence now. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but measured more carefully than before. I would request that the witness confine her testimony to the events of the night in question and avoid speculative connections to present positioning. The request was procedural, structured, an attempt to restore boundaries, to re-establish the framework that had once given him control, and for a moment, it created a pause, a space where authority might reassert itself. The judge considered him quietly, his expression unreadable, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the uncertainty visible, not dramatic, not overt, but present. And when he finally spoke, his tone carried a weight that did not favor either side. The witness will answer only to the facts as she observed them, he said, his eyes shifting briefly toward Evelyn. But the court will determine the relevance of those observations, and the statement, balanced as it was, did not return control to Jonathan. It simply refused to remove what had already been placed into the record. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the instruction without resistance. And that quiet compliance only strengthened her position, because it made clear that she was not pushing beyond the boundaries. She was simply standing within them more precisely than anyone had expected. Jonathan nodded once, a controlled motion, but his next words came slower. Each one weighed more carefully than before. Ms. Carter, he continued, his tone no longer carrying the same effortless authority. On the night in question, can you describe the positioning of individuals in your immediate line of sight? The question was narrower now, less aggressive, more cautious, an attempt to rebuild structure through detail rather than dominance. Evelyn did not hesitate. There were several people moving through the area, she said, her voice steady. But one individual remained directly between me and the person I observed. And again, the clarity of her phrasing carried further than its volume, because it did not leave room for interpretation. It simply placed the scene as it was. A juror wrote something down. Another nodded faintly, the kind of subtle engagement that signals understanding rather than confusion, and Jonathan saw it, recognized it, the shift from doubt to reconstruction, and he moved quickly. And you are certain that this individual was positioned in such a way as to obstruct your view? He asked, but the question no longer carried the force of a trap. It felt like an attempt to confirm rather than dismantle, and Evelyn answered with the same precision. Yes, she said. But only until that individual moved. And that addition, small yet critical, extended the timeline. reshaped the sequence, and Jonathan's expression tightened slightly. Because each answer was not just responding, it was building, constructing a version of events that no longer aligned with the one he had presented. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of attention, focused, deliberate, and increasingly aligned with the clarity that Evelyn had introduced, and Jonathan Pierce, standing in the center of it, began to realize that the case was no longer something he could control through pressure alone, because the truth, once given structure, does not need to be defended, it simply needs to be heard. Jonathan Pierce understood something now that he had not allowed himself to consider before, that the structure he had relied on was no longer holding, not because it had been attacked, but because it had been revealed as incomplete, and that difference mattered more than any objection he could raise, because a broken argument can be repaired, but an exposed one cannot be hidden again. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that signaled adjustment rather than retreat, but the room had already begun to read him differently, not as the architect of the narrative, but as someone responding to it. And that shift, once visible, could not be reversed. When did this individual move? He asked, his voice steady, but stripped now of the earlier confidence that had guided every word, because timing had become critical, and if he could control the sequence, he could still contain the damage. Evelyn did not hesitate. Moments after the initial interaction, she replied, her tone precise, her pacing measured, as if each word had already been placed long before this moment arrived. There was a brief interruption, and during that time, the obstruction cleared. The phrasing was simple, but its implication extended beyond the surface, because it established not only visibility, but opportunity, a window in which observation became clear and uninterrupted. Jonathan nodded slowly, as though processing, but in reality recalculating, searching for a point where uncertainty could be reintroduced. And during that window, he continued, choosing his words carefully. You are claiming that your view was unobstructed and your identification was made? It was a statement, framed as a question, an attempt to lock her into a position that could still be challenged, still be tested under scrutiny. Evelyn's answer came without strain. Yes, she said. And again, that single word carried more weight than it should have, because it was no longer isolated. It was supported by a sequence that made sense, by a structure that had grown stronger with each clarification. A juror leaned back, arms crossing slowly, not in doubt, but in consideration, as if the pieces were beginning to align in a way that had not been visible before, and Jonathan saw it, felt it, the quiet shift of perception moving further away from him. He stepped slightly to the side, repositioning himself as if the angle of his presence could influence the direction of the case. Let us focus on specifics, he said, his tone firm again, attempting to regain precision. At what distance did this observation occur? The question was technical, grounded, designed to bring the testimony back into measurable terms, where uncertainty often thrives. Evelyn answered with the same calm clarity. Approximately 15 to 20 feet, she said, but with a direct line of sight at that moment. And the addition, once again, reinforced the sequence, strengthened the timeline, and removed the ambiguity he was trying to reintroduce. Jonathan paused, just briefly, but this time the pause was visible, not strategic, and the courtroom felt it, the subtle break in momentum that no longer belonged to him. The judge watched closely, his attention unwavering, while the jury remained still, engaged, no longer passive observers, but active participants in reconstructing the truth being presented. Evelyn continued, not because she was prompted, but because the moment allowed it. It was clear, she said, her voice steady, not because of distance, but because of timing. And that distinction, simple yet precise, reframed the entire discussion once more, shifting focus away from limitations and toward clarity. Jonathan Pierce had built his case on controlling what was seen, what was heard, and how it was interpreted. But now, standing in a courtroom where each word he spoke seemed to narrow his own position rather than expand it, he began to understand something he had never needed to consider before, that control, once lost to truth, does not return through force, it dissolves quietly, leaving only what can stand on its own. Jonathan Pierce no longer asked questions the way he had at the beginning. There was no longer that effortless rhythm, that quiet dominance that once guided every exchange. Instead, there was calculation, visible now, deliberate, almost cautious, and the courtroom felt it. Because when control becomes visible, it is no longer control, it is effort, and effort can be measured. He turned slightly toward the jury, as if trying to re-establish connection, to remind them of the structure he had built. Earlier, ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone measured, composed but thinner than before. We are being asked to rely on a moment that lasted only seconds, under conditions that were far from ideal. The statement was broad, an attempt to widen the frame again, to dilute the precision Evelyn had introduced, to bring uncertainty back into the room where clarity had begun to settle. But even as he spoke, the words did not land the same way, because the jury was no longer listening for authority. They were listening for consistency, and that difference changed everything. Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly together, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried something that could not be overlooked, not confidence, not defiance, but certainty, the kind that does not need to convince, only to exist. Jonathan turned back toward her, narrowing the focus once more. "Miss Carter," he said, "is it your testimony that during this brief window, from approximately 15 to 20 feet away, you were able to make a reliable identification?" The question was framed carefully, structured to sound reasonable, to sound grounded, but beneath it was a final attempt to compress her statement into something fragile, something that could still be questioned. Evelyn did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried further than any explanation could have, because it was no longer standing alone. It was supported by everything that had already been established, by timing, by positioning, by clarity that had not changed under pressure. A juror nodded slightly, almost unconsciously. Another wrote something down, and those small movements, those quiet acknowledgments, spoke louder than any argument Jonathan could make, because they signaled something he could no longer control: belief. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not show defeat but cannot hide strain, and for a moment, he said nothing, and that silence, once his tool, now belonged to the room itself, no longer shaped by his pacing, no longer controlled by his voice. The judge watched closely, his expression steady, but there was a shift there as well, not in decision, not yet, but in attention, focused now on what had been revealed rather than what had been presented. Evelyn's voice came again, not louder, not more forceful, but final in a way that could not be undone. "What I saw was not unclear," she said, "only misunderstood." And that distinction settled over the courtroom with quiet weight, because it did not challenge the process, it completed it. Jonathan Pierce had built his case on shaping perception, on guiding what others believed they understood. But now, standing in a space where perception had been corrected rather than controlled, he faced something he could not dismantle with argument alone, because the truth he had tried to narrow had expanded beyond his reach. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer about what could be questioned, it was about what could no longer be denied. The silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt settled, as if the courtroom had quietly arrived at a place it could not move away from. And Jonathan Pierce understood it in a way that no argument could undo. Because this was not about losing control in a dramatic moment. It was about watching control dissolve piece by piece until there was nothing left to direct. He stood still for a fraction longer than he intended, his mind moving through options that no longer held the same weight. Objections that would sound forced, redirections that would only highlight what had already been revealed. And for the first time in years, the path forward was not something he could see clearly. He glanced briefly toward the judge, then back to Evelyn Carter, as if searching for something unresolved, something he could still challenge. But there was nothing left that had not already been clarified. Nothing left that could be reframed without exposing the attempt itself. "No further questions," he said finally. And the words, simple as they were, carried a weight far heavier than their meaning, because they did not signal completion, they signaled acceptance. And the moment they left his mouth, the shift in the room became undeniable. The judge nodded once, his expression composed, but his voice carried a firmness that settled the proceedings into something final. The witness may step down, and all eyes followed Evelyn as she rose, not with urgency, not with relief, but with the same quiet composure she had held from the beginning, her movements measured, her presence unchanged, as if nothing in the room had altered her, even though everything around her had shifted. The jury watched closely, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, because the testimony they had just heard was no longer something to question. It was something to understand, something that had reshaped the case without force, without volume, simply through clarity. Jonathan remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture still controlled, his expression carefully held, but there was no longer a sense of command in it, only stillness, the kind that follows when there is nothing left to direct. A faint movement passed through the gallery, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the quiet acknowledgement that something significant had just occurred, something that would carry beyond this room. The judge made a note, then looked up, his gaze steady as he addressed the court. "We will proceed with a brief recess," he said, and the gavel came down lightly, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a marker, a boundary between what had been argued and what had now been understood. As people began to shift, to stand, to whisper quietly among themselves, Evelyn Carter stepped away from the stand, her path simple, unremarkable, yet every movement carried the weight of what had just taken place, because she had not raised her voice, she had not challenged authority, she had not forced the truth into the room, she had simply allowed it to arrive, exactly when it needed to. And in that moment, as Jonathan Pierce turned slightly, his gaze no longer fixed forward but searching, recalculating, the realization settled deeper than any verdict ever could, that the case had not been lost in a single statement. It had been undone by the quiet precision of truth that no strategy could contain, and the courtroom, now filled with a different kind of silence, held on to that realization long after the words themselves had faded. The courtroom never fully returned to what it had been before that moment, even as people filed back in after the brief recess. Even as the formal structure resumed and voices regained their measured tones, something quieter had already taken hold, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. Jonathan Pierce sat at counsel table, his posture still composed, his presence still precise, but the energy around him had shifted in a way that no preparation could restore, because the room no longer leaned toward him, it observed him, and that difference, subtle yet absolute, changed everything. Across the room, Evelyn Carter took her seat among the witnesses, her hands resting calmly, her gaze steady, not searching for acknowledgement, not seeking validation, because what had been said no longer required reinforcement. It had already done its work. The jury returned with a different kind of attention now, not divided, not uncertain, but focused, as though they were no longer trying to follow a narrative, but to understand one that had revealed itself piece by piece. And in that shift, the case itself felt different, not louder, not more dramatic, but clearer. The judge entered, the room rose, and as proceedings resumed, the structure of the trial continued as expected. Motions were noted, timelines reviewed, arguments outlined. But beneath all of it, the foundation had changed, because the central question was no longer clouded by assumption. It had been reframed by clarity that could not be undone. Jonathan spoke again when required, his voice controlled, his argument structured, but there was a restraint now, a precision that came not from dominance, but from awareness, because he understood, perhaps more than anyone else in that room, that the turning point had already passed, and what remained was not a battle for control, but a process moving toward its natural conclusion. Evelyn did not speak again. She did not need to. Her testimony had already settled into the record in a way that did not invite reinterpretation, only recognition, and that was the quiet power of it, not in what it added, but in what it revealed. The jury listened, the judge observed, and the case moved forward, but the tension that had once driven the room had softened into something else, something steadier, something that did not rely on persuasion, but on understanding. And when the day came to a close, when the final statements were noted and the proceedings adjourned, there was no dramatic ending, no sudden declaration, only a quiet sense that what needed to be seen had already been seen. Jonathan Pierce gathered his files, his movements precise as always, but slower, more deliberate, as if each step now carried the weight of something beyond strategy. And as he turned to leave, his gaze passed briefly across the courtroom, not searching, not challenging, simply acknowledging what had unfolded. Evelyn Carter stood as well, her path unchanged, her presence as quiet as it had been from the beginning. And as she walked toward the exit, the room